Good afternoon. I'm Julie Shaw, CEO of Disability Solutions for Independent Living that serves the Volusia and Flagler counties in Florida. I also serve as the network of centers representative on the Florida Independent Living Council. And this year I was the chair of the Florida Association CIL Legislative Committee. But before we walk into the content of the meeting, I'd first like to extend my great appreciation to the Independent Living Resource Center in Jacksonville for assisting me in setting up this training webinar for anyone to attend. And also for the members of the Florida Association of Centers for Independent Living to realize that before people travel to Washington this July, that we want to make sure all of our advocates are practicing the same techniques when we're in the Capitol and seeing elected congressional officials and staff, and that our message is sent coordinated and we're sending the same message. So the timing of this training is essential for our work of advocacy that we need to conduct currently. There are serious issues that require our advocacy at the federal level right now, and I know many of you are aware of them. But several of those items can impact the quality of life for not only us, but the people that we serve through our organizations. Our least restrictive setting requirements under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act is being threatened by the significant proposed Medicaid cuts, which then would force people back into institutions. And also, as you know, the hot topics are benefits, healthcare, and more. So this is a very pivotal, important time for people with disabilities, advocates for people with disabilities, and lobbyists for people with disabilities. And once again, I just want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you very much for your patience with our technical difficulties despite our rehearsals. And thank you for taking the time on this very important topic. I'm not sure if everybody heard my introduction or not. So first I'd like to express my appreciation to the Independent Living Resource Center. And thank you for setting up and coordinating this training as a webinar for anyone to join. And I'd like to thank the Florida Association of Centers for Independent Living to also use today's tool as a basis for the great advocacy work that we are going to conduct in Washington during July. There are serious advocacy needs at the federal level right now. Hey, Madison, I'm not sure how much people have heard.
You cut out for just a second, Julie, but you're back.
Okay. So the issues that we need to address and perform good advocacy techniques include quality of life issues, not only for us, but also for the people that we serve through our agencies. The least restrictive setting requirement of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act is being threatened by the Medicaid cuts, which will reduce the ability to receive services in the community, as well as individuals' benefits, access to health care, and the list can just go on and on and on right now in Washington. So I appreciate everybody's time to sign on to this training so that whether you go to Washington or not, that you can implement your own advocacy efforts and recognize the difference between advocacy and lobbying in order to protect your nonprofit agency. So what's the difference? What's the difference between the goals of advocacy and lobbying? They're actually very similar. The issue is the process. The process of advocacy, providing advocacy, and the process of lobbying are very different. just by definition, as we all know, advocacy, one of the definitions means to argue. But advocacy is attempting to cause political action, not provide political action, but to cause political action using methods such as civil education and public campaigns with the aim to influence the decision makers that are involved in the issue you're concerned about. Lobbying actually refers to influencing government at all levels, local, state, and federal, and its leaders. And because of the influence of proposed legislation or pending legislation or new legislation, lobbyists must register to be a lobbyist. So let's continue with how is lobbying different than general advocacy? Lobbying involves attempts to influence, that's an important word, specific legislation at the local, state, or federal level. And advocacy is focused on education about a specific issue. So I was a lobbyist for 16 years, and I've been an advocate my entire career, over 30 years, for people with disabilities. When I was a lobbyist, one of the things I used to do was once I got a bill numbered, I would then contact all the different organizations that potentially would be interested in that bill. I would ask for a letter of support. And when I got that letter of support, I would put it on a summary sheet and list people out, or the organizations in a list, and have the bills at the top of the document. But then when I walked into an office, I would highlight in yellow the organizations from that elected official's community so they know which organizations in their area are supporting the lobbying efforts. That's one technique I've used as a lobbyist. As an advocate, I would never put any bill numbers on a piece of paper and ask people to support, not support, etc., and hand that over to an elected official. The primary focus of advocacy is what we all know, the stories behind the topic. Advocacy and telling the story of an individual or a group of individuals has more impact as one of the best techniques you can use as an advocate. So it's important. Can you tell the story? And can you apply that story to what's happening at the local, state, or federal level? Lobbying is actually just a small portion of the total amount of advocacy efforts that are completed by most nonprofits. So advocacy efforts with most nonprofits are the primary, I would say, role to influence elected officials, to educate elected officials on the topic and how it impacts a person. And I could tell you elected officials and their staff actually value stories and how that can impact a person more so many times than lobbying. So it's important to protect your nonprofit agency when deciding to maybe engage in formal lobbying efforts. So are nonprofits allowed to lobby? This is one of the biggest myths that remains out there today. People continue to believe that if they're a nonprofit, they're not allowed to lobby. And that answer, of course, it's a myth. You are allowed to lobby as a nonprofit. So under the requirements from the IRS, the language that is applied to nonprofits, quote, no organization may qualify for Section 501c3 status if a substantial part of its activities is attempting to influence legislation. And remember, tie the word influence with lobbying. A nonprofit 501c3 can engage in lobbying, but too much lobbying activity risks the loss of your tax-exempt status. So what is an advocacy strategy? Advocacy efforts must both be logical and flexible to achieve the desired results. In other words, you can lay out your plan on how you're going to advocate for a specific topic. But I can tell you, with the number of elected officials' offices I have walked into, that you have got to be able to be flexible in your approach. Because once you start your advocacy efforts, the person listening to the education and the advocacy efforts will sometimes throw a question at you or look at what you're saying differently and explain that. So not only do you have to be able to be responsive to how the person is receiving the information or interpreting the information, but also in an advocacy plan, you also need to revise. Usually when I work advocacy efforts on an all-day effort, I will re-examine what occurred during the day at night and most likely or very commonly amend my strategy efforts to encompass any perception of people I've already talked to, any questions that already occurred in those meetings, etc. The most important thing you can do as an advocate is engage stakeholders and coalition members. And you want to engage them early on, not after legislation is filed or legislation has appeared in the public arena. As an advocate, you want to establish those stakeholder relationships and coalition member relationships well prior to then deciding to pick up an advocacy issue, because your relationships with the people you work with is your foundation from which you build your advocacy efforts. And it's another way to acquire buy-in on the topic or advocacy effort that you are pursuing. This also, the coalitions, stakeholder meetings, etc., and I'm going to give some additional examples later on. That effort also helps the group as a body articulate their advocacy goals and objectives. And those are two words, once again, you should tie with advocacy. What is your goal? What is your objective? Because once again, influence is tied to lobbying. Here's some samples of advocacy. Educating the public. It could be an individual. It could be a group in a meeting. It could be the public in general by reaching out to the public, holding public forums, holding public hearings on a topic, inviting elected officials to come listen to what's being said. Organizing committees. It's always very useful when you have more than one entity advocating on the topic or the goal. So organize committees under your coalitions or stakeholders so that the committees can potentially be performing different roles on your advocacy agenda. Educate, 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 not just legislators, but everyone that you come in contact with on your issue. Encourage voting. Encourage people to vote. And of course, all Centers for Independent Living or all disability programs under the motor voter law from the federal law are required to ask people if they'd like to register, update, etc. That kind of activity is not lobbying. That is educating and encouraging voters to vote. Partisan political activities. As an advocate, you must always work with both parties or all parties involved. We have several political parties in the United States. We have more than just independent, Democratic, and Republican parties. As an advocate, you must serve and support all political parties. You can't just provide advocacy to one party and not the other. You need to do it across the board. That way, you are viewed as partisan. Hold educational conferences. Complete your research. Now, research can include other resources that can benefit you or the person that you may represent. And research will also include know your topic. Make sure that what you're saying in your advocacy efforts is actually factual, not maybe your perception of a law, a regulation, or a provision that's pending or has passed, but research your topic. One thing I know with a lot of people with disabilities from being in the field this long, they'll advocate from their perspective. Like a person who uses a wheelchair will very commonly advocate for physical accessibility. But as an advocate, you need to be all-inclusive of the various disability groups. And that's why I encourage you to research your topic, research your resources, which can be groups that join your effort, or it can also be resources of other agencies that want to agree to the advocacy agenda and join your efforts. Nonpartisan peer education is always welcomed. But once again, it has to be nonpartisan. There are IRS lobbying exceptions included in the law, which we will touch later. Another form of leadership, another form of advocacy efforts is leadership training, or change your corporate behavior. And I think this is one topic that anybody who's involved in a nonprofit now should be looking at this topic. What can we do as a nonprofit to change our corporate behavior in order to maybe access funds that have never been available before? Or you see a lot of information coming out about the medical model from a health perspective being combined with community advocacy and agencies, and how community agencies can make the effort to comply with the data that's driven by health sectors and health reporting, etc. So if you want to access more funds, then that would require potentially you change your corporate behavior and influence regulations. Now, you're probably sitting there saying, wait, influence has to do with lobbying. Influence is attending regulation hearings, submitting comments or opinions while the regulations is open for public comment. And then, of course, tracking the process of the regulation that you're concerned with. For those of you who aren't sure where regulation fits into processes, most of the time when a law is passed, the next step is to create the regulations. The regulations are basically the process to help guide people in application of the law. It can provide definitions that aren't in the law. It can add determination by a federal, state, or local entity how specific language in the law shall be applied. So it's very important as an advocate that you just not look at what's happening legislatively, but you make contacts with those entities that are holding the regulation hearings, like the Agency for Healthcare Administration on anything to do with Medicaid. So don't just stop at the passage of any kind of law advocating, continue it into the regulation process. And of course, litigation is a form of advocacy. Our government is designed with the three parts of government, and our courts are very important, especially for people with disabilities who are still in the infantile stage of pursuing their civil rights. So litigation is another form of advocacy. It is not, you should not consider that a no-no. I was remiss in saying, if you have any questions, I am going to remain online until all questions are answered, regardless of the time. So I'd also like to ask if you would write your question down or make a note in case you can't remember it at the end of the training. So how can a nonprofit support a political candidate? When a nonprofit is involved in political campaign activities, that becomes a risk to the tax-exempt agency. Because, as I said earlier, under IRS, a charitable nonprofit promises in their filing of the 501c3 the federal government that it will not engage in political campaign activity, and if it does, IRS regulations then mandate that the charitable nonprofit will lose its tax-exempt status. But there are different ways to be involved and increase the level of lobbying in your nonprofit without threatening your 501c3. And I'm gonna walk through that in this training as well. What is advocacy work? So advocacy comes in all kinds of forms, but the overall advocacy effort is to ensure that people, particularly those who are the most vulnerable in society, are able to what? Have their voice heard on issues that are important to them. I can remember being a lobbyist. I've been a lobbyist for 16 years, proudly for the 3 chapters of the Paralyzed Veterans of America in Florida. And then I also remained a registered lobbyist under Governor Jeb Bush on disability issues only. So you want to make sure that the most vulnerable people in society are able to. And I can remember the days of walking the halls in our state capitol where I would never see a person with a disability there. But now I'm seeing more and more people with disabilities. So back then, and even today, I still talk about people with disabilities whose voices are not heard because they can't get there, or because of their disability, they can't convey a clear message to elected officials, local government, etc. So that issue is still here, is still alive and well, even though more and more people with disabilities are in the Capitol, seeing their elected officials, more people with disabilities are attending local meetings, etc. So your first role is to make sure that the unheard voice is heard. Second, for people with disabilities, we have to defend and safeguard our rights. As I said, this civil rights movement is in its infantile stage. The ADA is just less than 30 years old. So if you compare that to the race issues under civil rights, look at how long race issues have been addressed in the United States, and race issues still remain a challenge today in our country. So especially for people with disabilities, all rights are never just guaranteed forever. So we have to defend those rights and safeguard them. And it's also important to have your views and wishes generally considered when decisions are being made about the people you serve and their lives, because you are the expert. You are the expert conveying that message. And so it's very important that they are genuinely considered. As a lobbyist and as an advocate, I can tell you, in elected officials' arena, regardless where it is, you are only as good as your word. And I have seen lobbyists who have even fudged or made up things in a meeting or lied. And I have watched those lobbyists. Once it's recognized, they no longer are slowly, by each elected official, eliminated in their contacts. So as an advocate, the same rule applies. You are only as good as your word. And that's why it's important that you have a plan, that you've done your research, that you know what the details of the topic is not what you believe them to be. Should a nonprofit do advocacy? Frankly, you can't afford not to. Actually, with all the changes at the federal level that's occurring, it's like the foundation of shifting all nonprofit work to private foundations. I don't know if anybody has looked at that, but that's my perception, that government wants to do less and less in serving people with disabilities because of costs, and they expect these private foundations to pick up all the needs of the community. So why else can't you afford to do advocacy? Because advocacy creates systemic change. And systemic change is one of the most valuable results that you can obtain as an advocate. It's also, advocacy is important to sustain your organization. Now, that can be seen in two different ways. If you have that relationship and you serve an elected official and help them with their constituents, or you become their go-to person anytime a constituent calls with a disability issue, then you are sustaining your organization. And when they look at their budget, they're going to look at your line item. Because you've taken good care of that elected official, usually that is returned by them taking good care of your organization. So you essentially create a formal partnership through advocacy efforts. Educating elected officials for better policy, once again, who knows better than people with disabilities or the people that serve them? They are the experts. And build those relationships. Get to know your policymakers at all levels. And policymakers are not just elected officials. Like in your local county, you have a county manager. In your city, you have a city manager. So those people that have their fingers in all the different pies are key people you should be approaching, not just the elected officials. Because I can tell you, advocacy with staff can carry a lot further. Because staff does what? They produce proposed documents. They may even be writing a bill for an elected official, etc. So establishing those relationships with staff, legislative staff, assistants, committee staff. I even established a relationship with bill writing staff, because I always had problems with bill writing, producing language that I didn't think was appropriate for people with disabilities. So I actually moved to writing my own legislation and then carrying it into bill writing to work with that person who's assigned to that project. Staff are very important, and they're just as equally important as an elected official. When you provide advocacy, you are empowering your constituents and your communities. And that is what is needed to get that message out very clearly. Advocacy does work. I can speak to it personally. The issue is organizing it, creating relationships, bringing other people into your issues, setting goals and objectives, and making a plan. Some additional examples of advocacy is tell your elected official how a federal grant your organization receives has helped your constituents. That's a positive conversation. You do not want to be talking to elected officials only when you're asking for something or when you want to advocate for change. You should be talking to your elected officials when positive things are happening, when things are going good, when, as this bullet says, when you can see the impact of that grant upon the people you serve. Personalize it, tell the story as an advocate. Educate an elected official about the effects of a policy on your constituency, which many times can be positive, but it can also be negative and have that negative result, which is why what's occurring at the federal level is such an important issue for all of us in this field at this time. Invite an elected official into your organization. Invite them to your events in the community so they can see firsthand, one, how you provide services, two, how your funding is impacting the people you serve, and how policy can affect your day-to-day operations and the difference that can make in your organization and with the people you serve. You have to keep in mind that these activities I just provided as examples cross the line into lobbying if you call for action, or you request introduced legislation, or you request a pending regulation. Okay? So this training has helped you to divide those lines and not create any gray matter in the middle. Tips on how to be an effective advocate. Join a disability listserv on the internet. Develop an email contact list. Attend community meetings. Do you go to a meeting and never introduce yourself to whoever's running the meeting? Or if there's an opportunity for public comment, even if it's your first meeting, get up, take the 3 minutes or 5 minutes, introduce yourself, tell them where you're from and why you decided to attend the meeting, why this meeting may be or is important to the people you serve. Also, another technique, whether you're an advocate or I'll share that later on because it applies to both. Apply to be appointed by elected officials to a local disability board. Approach your city managers, your assistant managers. Approach planning departments. Approach your transportation department, your elections department, your parks and recreation. Any topic that you want to advocate for, I can assure you there are staff within the government structure that you can go and apply your advocacy efforts beyond elected officials. When an opportunity arises to advocate and presents itself, you need to ask yourself some questions. Is there a real concern? It's very easy to get caught up in the hype or be influenced by someone's opinion on the topic. You need to examine the topic yourself. So is there a real concern? And what can be done about it? And those are two important questions I ask myself on a continual basis. If you're going to a meeting, go prepared. Write down the issues that you need to discuss and any questions or the issues that brought you to that meeting. Request a copy of policy and procedures as it pertains to the issue. I am someone who is always pulling public records as an advocate. I pull public records as allowed under the Florida Public Records Law and the Florida Sunshine Law. But if you really want to get in the nitty-gritty, then I go past the regulations into policies and procedures and the actual application of what is applied under the legislation. Understand what is being said at all times. Don't sit in a meeting and hear something and go, I don't understand that. Ask for clarification. And these techniques are also contributed to your research. You know, if you don't understand, ask. The most important thing about being an effective advocate is stand up, leave your desk, leave your organization, and spend time outside of your organization formally performing advocacy efforts to policymakers, legislators, staff, etc. The list is continual. It doesn't end. Anybody who could potentially come across that topic is who you need to go see. You cannot advocate effectively from behind your desk because they need to put a face with the topic, especially for elected officials. You can write letters and you can send emails, but to do real effective advocacy, get out of your office. Go to your elected officials, go to your staff, go to their meetings and participate in their meetings, even if they're after 5 o'clock. I'm in city council meetings and all kinds of hearings and those type of functions that occur after 5. You have to go and show up. Go to your city council meetings, county commission meetings, state department meetings, or even legislative meetings. Go to the Capitol, go to Washington, D.C. Call ahead of time, make an appointment, and arrive on time. Hand the person your business card, have something to leave for them, and I'm not talking about a gift. I am talking about only a 1-page of information on what you discussed in your advocacy topic or what your advocacy topic is. So you always leave something behind. You're not only going to give them your business card, you're going to hand them a 1-pager and no more. Be brief. Many times I've watched advocates go off into what I call the weeds, and I watch legislators or elected officials and their eyes sort of glaze over. So the shorter your message, the more direct your message is, the better job you've done as an advocate. I can tell you as an advocate, I have done advocacy walking up the stairs with an elected official to a committee meeting. I have done advocacy in less than 2 minutes, which is sometimes all you're afforded by that elected official, or they'll say, walk with me. And that's where your advocacy is going to occur. So you must be brief because there's a lot of other stimulation and things going on around you, and stay on script. Never whine. Don't go into an office and whine and whine and whine. You're going to turn them off, and then you're going to eliminate your opportunity for them to be turning to you because of your expertise. So you must make your goal in advocacy to get a commitment. So you have to be able to say what that is if you want someone or an elected official or a staffer to agree with your issue or advocacy goal, etc. So don't make it cloudy. Be very specific about what you're talking about. And brief, of course, is respectful of their time. If you have never spoken in a committee meeting, it's important for you to be able to say what your issue is in 3 minutes or less, and to get that message across effectively. Some people have to practice that because they tend to not stay on script, they tend not to be brief. That is a skill that must be obtained as an advocate, and it's also a skill that is obtained as a lobbyist. You have to be able to educate, send the message in the shortest amount of time possible. Don't leave. Okay, I'm probably confusing you now. But basically, in this message, I'm saying leave the office, but don't leave the consciousness of the person or the agency. Make a lasting positive impression and follow up your visit with a thank you letter. I, by practice, do not send thank you letters by email. I handwrite them. And I speak about that appointment because out of all the emails and all the mail that gets plumped down on a desk in our world today, that thank you letter, when they get to it, because it's handwritten, is going to stand out more than any of the other correspondence they received that day. Offer to provide data and feedback as to lawmakers as they debate issues, or even as a county council is discussing an item. After you've gotten up, introduced yourself, and explained to them your concerns with the topic. All of these efforts turn you into a familiar face. And then what happens when you're a familiar face and they know that you are accurate in your information, you don't embellish your information, you don't guess about what you're about an answer to a question, they will be calling you to help them with information, to help them with their constituents, to help them understand a topic. And that's what you want to be through your advocacy efforts. You want to be their go-to person on anything related to disability. It's very important when you are in a meeting with any staff person or elected official that if you're asked a question and you don't know the exact answer, do not try to guess what it is. Do not take your existing knowledge and, through logic, try to apply it to the answer. Don't do that. Your first response needs to be, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to your question. The next response is, but I am going to get your answer for you as soon as possible, and I will make sure that I return or communicate back to you that answer. Don't guess, because that's when people get off in the weeds. And if you're guessing, then that's a reflection about, is that person's word as good as it should be? And that's what creates those kind of questions in those settings. If you don't know the answer is, I don't know. Lobbying. What's a lobbyist? A lobbyist is an activist who seeks to persuade, or like I said earlier, influence members of government, like members of Congress, to enact legislation that would benefit their customers that they're contracted with. So the lobbying profession is a legitimate and integral part of our democratic political process in the United States. Unfortunately, it's not very well understood by the general population. But I could tell you some of the best things about lobbyists is they are our guru on the encyclopedia of the topic or the entity they represent. So many times lobbyists help staff because the topics are so vast that a lobbyist that's an expert in one specific area can be that encyclopedia for the elected official or the person. And actually, as an advocate, you should strive to be able to perform at the same level through advocacy efforts, not through lobbying. Examples of lobbying. Asking an elected official to vote for or against or amend introduced legislation. Okay? Many times people say, oh, send this email on House Bill blah, 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 and tell them you don't support it, or sign on to this letter. That is no longer advocacy. Once you have any kind of bill number, once you have any kind of introduced legislation or an amendment, and if you're influencing their vote, that is not advocacy. That's what lobbyists are for. So that's why it's good for a nonprofit agency, of course, to perform their advocacy efforts, but it's also good for that nonprofit agency to have a lobbyist to do what you can't do as an advocate. Directly talk about those bills. Ask for legislation to be introduced. Vote for or against the topic that's pending. Emailing a call to action to your members or coalition and urging them to contact their elected official in support or opposition of introduced legislation or pending regulations is lobbying. Preparing materials or organizing events in support of lobbying activities is also viewed as lobbying. So, when I talked about going around and getting letter supports from all the different organizations that supported the proposed bill that I drafted and worked with, got my sponsors, worked with the bill writing, and then started making that list, I did that as a registered lobbyist. I did not do that as an advocate. I don't do that as an advocate. So most people don't know there's a variety of tax options for organizations. And the chart in front of you spells out many of the different types of 501c that you can actually declare yourself as and still maintain your tax exemption. So some examples of the 501c3 public charities, of course, are Centers for Independent Living, State Independent Living Councils, Easter Seals, the ARCs, the Alliance for Justice, and the list just goes on and on. They all maintain their tax-exempt status. Contributions are tax deductible, and private foundation grants are also allowed under this structure. Your lobbying activities as a 501c3 is limited, and I'm going to explain how you figure out what's substantial and what's not substantial lobbying activities. The electoral activities as a 501c3, you cannot support or oppose a specific candidate for office. You must be nonpartisan. The next type of categories for nonprofit, you can be a 501c4, a 501c5, or a 501c6. Some examples of those are the AARP, the Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. So it's not the nonprofit that's a 501c3. They actually filed under another 501c category to actually do action campaigns for lobbying. They're still tax exempt under the 4, 5, and 6. Their lobbying activities are unlimited. And that's why the different filing under a 501c4, 5, or 6 is desirable, because the lobbying activity is unlimited. And for instance, some of you may have seen the letter that AARP sent out to the Senate President McConnell in Washington, basically in a very nice, somewhat nice way, threatening him that if, and actually threatening his reelection, that if he doesn't support the funding needed for Medicaid, if he continues to drive the agenda of the Medicaid cuts, then they're going to make sure, which is what this correspondent said, they're going to make sure he doesn't get reelected again. That is lobbying, okay? And that's why the AARP was able to do it, because they filed as a C4, a C5, or a C6. So actually, that activity still has to be a secondary activity. It can't be the primary activity of the entity. So let's just, everybody knows who AARP is. So they provide services to their members, which is their primary activity. Influencing legislation or under a tax-exempt status is their secondary activity. And that's how the IRS separates and determines what's substantial, what's unsubstantial. Then there are, of course, political organizations that are created just for that purpose, and they're 527s. So you can see action funds filed as political organizations. You can see different supporting entities filing as support to political organizations, etc. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, etc. And they're still tax exempt, okay? But their lobbying activities are rare and usually taxable, okay? Because it's usually their sole activity of why they were created and what purpose or services they're providing. So there's a variety of ways to classify a tax-exempt organization that serves the community. And I would encourage all of you, if you're considering formally engaging in lobbying and you're considering how much of that lobbying activity your organization needs, that you explore all the variety of tax options for organizations to meet your individual needs. As I spoke before, the IRS talks about there's an insubstantial part test and there's a default test to determine if your lobbying activity is considered substantial or not substantial, okay? Lobbying is an insubstantial part of the organization's activities. And when you look for a definition from Congress, there isn't one. There's no definition. So you're left, all of us are left up to determine, well, what is insubstantial? All nonprofit organizations. And another way, which is risky, because that's an opinion that you're forming of whether your lobbying activities are substantial or insubstantial without a definition. Okay. Another sure way to determine that is a default test, or what people refer to as a 501H expenditures test. A nonprofit only has to elect that one time by submitting the IRS Form 5768. The determination in the default test is dollar-based limits. And dollar-based limits is how much money is spent on lobbying and what those expenses are. So it's actually a mathematical process to determine if your lobbying activities are going to be substantial or not substantial. And actually, mathematical application of the IRS rules is many times safer than you determining what's insubstantial for your organization to maintain your tax exempt. So if you want to measure lobbying activities, I strongly encourage an expenditure test, not you determining unknown definition. So if the amount of exempt purpose expenditures is less than $500,000, then your lobbying non-taxable amount is 20% of the exempt purpose expenditures. Okay, so it's done by math. So $500,000 up to $1 million, you can see you can go up to $100,000 in lobbying expenses plus 15% of the excess of exempt purpose expenditures over $500,000. So if you look at this chart, it varies by the amount of money that's being spent strictly on lobbying, which is not consulting services. Let's clarify that. And based on how much you're spending, what's your limit, and what's the formula. So you can make sure that you maintain your nonprofit status the amount of money you're spending on lobbying. So this kind of information totally eliminates that myth that nonprofits are not allowed to lobby. For those of you in Florida, it costs money to hire a lobbyist. And depending on the success of your lobbyist, you can pay significant funds. The median annual lobbyist salary in Tallahassee is $97,337 as of the end of May of this year. The common range for a lobbyist is $78,000 up to $134,000. There are lobbyists in Florida who make more than $134,000 because of their political connections. So that's just your median range. It's not technically what you need to hire a lobbyist. It depends on who you want to hire. So it doesn't include any bonus and benefit information and other factors, impact-based pay. That's just strictly pay for the lobbying services. The salary for someone with the title lobbyist may vary depending on a number of factors, including the industry they're lobbying for, the size of the company, the location of their company, the years of experience, and their level of education in the political arena. Excuse me. So, measuring lobbying, I would strongly encourage that you apply the math and that you track your expenditures. And if you need, and if they're going to exceed what would be considered substantial or substantial lobbying based on the numbers that then you explore different filings for your 501c3. So an organization's attempts to influence legislation, that's strictly lobbying. And if it is a substantial part of your organization's overall activities, then you've met the substantial part test. The IRS looks at a variety of factors when they're determining whether a nonprofit is substantial or not substantial in lobbying. They look at the amount of time devoted by both the lobbyist and the volunteer workers. So what does that tell you? You have to track your time lobbying. You have to document. And the IRS also looks at the expenditures devoted by the organization to lobbying when determining whether the lobbying activity is substantial or not. So as a 501c3, you don't want to have some kind of question from the IRS about your lobbying activity and you can't produce records. You must produce records. If you have a lobbyist who also serves as a consultant to the organization, then the difference in the roles must be documented as well. The lobbyist must document their lobbying time, who they spoke to, what was discussed, okay? And if you're a consultant, then that has to be separated out from your lobbying time. It can't be just considered lobbying. So it's important. That's another way to reduce your lobbying expenditures, is to actually use a consultant or hire a lobbyist who also serves as your consultant. And that's another way to control your expenditures. An organization that conducts excessive lobbying in any tax year may lose its tax-exempt status, resulting in all of its income being subject to tax. That's what the IRS does. So if they determine that your nonprofit is performing substantial lobbying services, then they will make you pay taxes on all of your nonprofit's income, which is not what we want to do, because that provides less funding for the people we serve. If in 501c3 organizations that lose their tax-exempt status due to excessive lobbying, now the exception is churches and private foundations. All other 501c3s are subject to an excise tax equal to 5% of their lobbying expenditures for the year in which they cease to qualify for exemption. So in some respect, that language is good, because if they determine you've exceeded and are providing substantial lobbying, then the penalty and the application is for that fiscal year, which gives you time to address it formally for the next year. I already talked about the tax and the 5%. Now, private foundations are subject to a different set of measurements. Okay. Churches are not subject to excise taxes on excessive lobbying. So foundations have a different set of rules than 501c3s. Your political campaigns in Schedule C. If you are doing lobbying, you need to file a Schedule C with your 990. And that's just another page on your 990. And on that page, you're going to put your total lobbying expenditures for that influence public opinion. You're going to provide total lobbying expenditures that influence a legislative body, direct lobbying. You're going to provide total lobbying expenditures. You're going to add them both up. You're going to provide other exempt purpose expenditures, if applicable. And then you are going to add it all up to provide your total exempt purpose expenditures. And you do that on a Schedule C in your 990. So if you haven't done formal lobbying before, there's a method to report in the 990 and to actually declare through your math whether you're a substantial or non-substantial lobbying agency. The Schedule C 990, lobbying is a non-taxable amount. So you enter the amount from the table in both columns, and the rest of this slide is the details of filling out that form. If your agency ever decides to file a Schedule C, then this these slides will be very helpful in completing the forms. And you can still see the same numbers. Not over $500,000 is 20% of the amount of the total, etc. So you're actually clarifying a mathematical determination of whether your agency is substantially lobbying or not substantially lobbying. Charities that do lobby are required to file the Schedule C as an attachment to the Form 990 or even the 90Z, and must report their lobbying activities on Part 2 of that schedule. So charities that measure their lobbying under the 501H category, the expenditure test report lobbying, files under Part 2A. Charities that measure lobbying under the insubstantial part test report lobbying on Part 2B. So this is just additional information to clarify how to fill out Schedule C. So how do you measure unsubstantial test for 501c3s? The substantial test is based on the facts and the circumstances of each case and, of course, your expenditures. Because that can be applied rather arbitrarily, it's often advised for a charity to file a short form with the IRS in order to be governed by the expenditure test, which is solely based on the amount of money spent for lobbying. To protect your tax-exempt status and the right to receive donations. And once again, here's the chart of how much your expenditures are and how much of your expenditures, what's your limit in determining whether it's substantial or not substantial. So if you spend $500,000 or less on lobbying activities only, then that should be no more than 20% of your entire nonprofit budget. Okay? So if you apply the formula in that way, the numbers on the left is your total cost of lobbying expenditures, and the numbers on the right is the total percent of your budget. And no 501c3s or 4s or anything like that can exceed $1 million. Now, grassroots lobbying expenditures may comprise no more than 25% of an organization's total allowable lobbying ceiling. So there is an exception for grassroots lobbying. It's higher than the expenditure test. Lobbying is all about knowing the difference between lobbying and advocacy. Tracking all your expenses, the cost to hire, staff time, mileage, money paid to attend dinners or activities where lobbying opportunities present themselves, the money you spend buying people dinners when you meet at a dinner meeting. Include the expenses in a lobbying line item and handle the line item just as you do the rest of the budget. Monthly reports, quarterly reports, etc. In Florida, you must register as a lobbyist for the branch that you want to lobby for. So you must register for the House, you must register for the Senate, and if you want to lobby the governor's office and his staff, you must register for the executive branch. You must submit reports, and it looks like I dropped off this bullet. You are required to submit reports by the state on not only who you're representing, your principals is what it's called, but in other words, who do you have contracts with? Those are your principals as a lobbyist, but also your expenditures. And you also must report any gifts that are provided. And there's been a big effort in Florida to reduce the gift giving to elected officials. So I would encourage people not to provide gifts. And when I was first working in the Capitol as a lobbyist, I saw all kinds of gifts would get carried in. Expensive paintings, all those kind of things, numbered artworks, and those kind of gifts are no longer allowed. Now, you can provide a gift to a lobbyist, for instance, I gave a senator a pen this past March. And I told him it cost less than $5. Well, this senator, who is so committed to being above reproach, mailed me a check for $10 and reported it on his gift report as an elected official. So legislative lobbying in Florida is any activity between a registered legislative or executive branch lobbyist and an elected official or their staff that involves working to influence the outcome of a policy issue or position within their branch of government. Schedule C, I'm not going to go over it. Hold on one second. I skipped okay. Florida lobbying rules. In Florida, if a company official meets privately with a state agency official to try to influence the outcome of an agency decision that will affect a class of people, a proposed rule, for example, the company official is lobbying the agency. However, the same company official who appears and testifies at that agency publicly noticed hearing or workshop to discuss the same proposed rule is advocacy. It is not lobbying. Nor is it lobbying to have a conversation with an agency official about an issue that affects only the company and no other persons. For example, the approval of an application you submitted. Executive lobbying is any activity between a registered executive branch lobbyist and an elected official or their staff that involves what? Influencing the outcome of a policy, a proposed law, etc., that affects the class of people. So in other words, an activity with the agency staffer to influence the outcome of a rule during a private conversation or meeting is lobbying. How are Florida lobbyists regulated? I've inserted the statutes, the rules, the registration, and the compensation reporting. If you click on those links, it should take you directly to the provisions in state statute, also in the rule chapter, Florida Administrative Code, etc., that governs lobbying in Florida. So at least you know, you can go to those sources and, as I said before, become informed. Know the details. Do your research. I already did this slide. For some reason it's out of order. Okay. I want to add some additional information before I start taking questions about how do you document. How do you document what you're doing? What's the difference? What am I going to document as an advocate versus what am I going to document as a lobbyist? I've already reviewed what lobbyists should be documenting: their time, who they're spoken to, you know, any expenditures that are spent on the lobbying effort. If it's traveling to volunteer at to help support a political campaign, those expenses must be reported. Okay. But if you're an advocate, how do you document your advocacy in case it ever comes up? Well, was that lobbying or was that advocacy? As an advocate, I document advocacy efforts, whether it's an individual advocacy effort on a topic for a person or whether it's systemic. In Centers for Independent Living, and I know a lot of people are maybe on the call who are from other agencies. In Centers for Independent Living, I document most of my systemic advocacy under my community activities reports. I talk about the topic. I talk about why I'm at that meeting. I talk about why I went to achieve, what did I want to achieve in that meeting? And then I also talk about what the outcome of that meeting. And that's the way I document all my advocacy activity, to make sure that if there's ever any question of whether you were lobbying at that time or not, I have the documentation of what I did. I also tell my staff in Centers for Independent Living, don't go to a meeting. You should not go to a meeting just to go to a meeting. If you're going to go to that meeting, then you have a purpose in being at that table. And if you don't have a purpose in being at that table, then you shouldn't be going to that meeting. So that's how I actually, if anybody's going to a community meeting, it's not just to attend the next meeting of that group. As advocates, you should be going once again with a purpose. You should be going with an issue. And that's why you're going to that meeting. That's why you want to get appointed to different community boards, to actual different committees at the state and local level, so that you have a purpose in advocating the issues that that group may cover. And so you should never go to a meeting if you are just going to go sit at the table and you're not going to have a goal for that specific meeting and you don't know what outcome that you want to obtain through that specific meeting. That concludes the PowerPoint training. And at this point in time, I am open to questions.
Julie, Tyler Morris.
Hey, Tyler.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and sharing all of your experience and kind of some good pointers for all of us to learn from. I wanted to see if you could speak to some of the items that you've seen other nonprofits and how they've leveraged their constituents that they serve through their agency to best communicate advocacy issues or important issues for the community and for the nonprofit agency.
Okay. I'm someone who doesn't like to do advocacy when it's very crowded, because then you're just another face in the mix. Even if you have that relationship with the person or the staffer, they're being inundated, with people coming into the office. So, when you have like days at the state capitol, Intellectual Disabilities Day, Transportation Disadvantage Day, I can be up in that Capitol advocating, but I'm not going to talk about those topics while everybody else is being inundated with people that are up there to see. One of the techniques I use as an advocate is I go before the crowd. I, as an advocate, would be in the Capitol when the sun rises, because you always have people who come in early who like to work when it's quiet. And when I do that, I get individual FaceTime. I am not competing with the next appointment. I am not competing with the groups walking the halls. I can talk about the topic that the day is designated for, or I can even talk about another topic. And another technique I use is I stay late. I stay after everybody leaves, because there's always staff and elected officials who rather have their quiet time after the day ends. So that's one of the techniques. It's a very valuable technique, Tyler, because I continually got individual FaceTime and was never rushed like you can be in an appointment during the day. Is that an example of a technique you're looking for?
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
Another technique I use, and before a lot of people with disabilities were in the Capitol, is because I have hidden disabilities, so I don't look like a person with a disability unless you pay really close attention to me. I always brought a person with a disability with me. You have to have the face of disabilities there. It goes really far. And so when I was lobbying and advocating, I did both, for the 3 chapters of the Paralyzed Veterans of America in Florida. I always had a veteran with me, because that's who I'm representing, whether it's lobbying or whether it's advocacy. To leverage your constituents, it's important for you to know that if you have an appointment as a constituent, you are more important than anybody in that hanging out in the hall, and even a registered lobbyist. Elected officials value information from their constituents more so than any other group. And they will tell you, you're the most important appointment. I've been in offices where there are several people waiting to talk to the elected official. And it's important when you make that appointment to see your elected officials at any level that you let them know you are their constituent. I live in your district. And some of them will actually ask you for your address, because sometimes, especially legislators, want to confirm that you are their constituent and in their district. And I also do that at the local level. So it's important to know that you don't have to be a lobbyist to be the most important person they want to talk to that day. All you have to do is be their constituent. So one technique that we're looking at in preparing for our visits in Washington is we are breaking up the state, and we're obtaining everybody's personal address, because I want to tie that constituent to the correct elected official when we're advocating in Washington. And that's why it's very important to know where people live, because they value you as a constituent. You are the most important. And it's important when you call, or you write, or you email, that you let them know you are a constituent. Okay? That's one technique. Another technique to empower people with disabilities or whoever you represent is to train. To train the people that you want to bring into those settings. To train them on what happens in those settings. What is, usually time is limited. And to also train them to stay on topic. And one way to do that is to create talking points. It's a handy tool, and it's different than maybe the one-pager you're going to leave behind in the office with your business card. You want to provide short, concise talking points for people to learn how to become empowered in these type of settings, because it's a specific technique. And as I said before, unless the topic is specific to your disability, the people we serve, people with disabilities that we want to take into these settings, we have to broaden their perspective so that their words are for all people with disabilities, not just their type. And that is a technique also that can be achieved through the talking points. To create those talking points, the research has to be completed. The details, digging into, the process, and actually even talking to staff about some of the other topics that people have brought up around the issue. So the most important thing is your research. Know your topic in detail. Your word has to be accurate, okay? Don't pretend you're the encyclopedia of everything that can possibly be asked. Just advise you don't know the answer, but you're going to get that answer for them right away. That's another technique. But when you take people with disabilities with you, it's important that you practice their story. Because I have found over the years that many times in trying to train a person with a disability to empower them in those settings, they have to practice their story. Because many times they'll put in facts or information that really doesn't make a difference on what we're talking about. And those kind of things eat up time, especially if someone doesn't stay on topic. So those are very important techniques to teach people with disabilities for them to become empowered in these type of settings, is to make sure they know who they're a constituent for, to be able to tell their story in chronological order, but to also pare down that story to a limited amount of time. And once again, I'm going to say 3 minutes, in case you have to talk to somebody while they're walking, or they've only have 3 minutes to sit down with you. So that takes practice to be able to share facts, be accurate, explain your topic, and also end it with what needs to occur on this issue, why you're there, and to personalize in the middle of that, the story. So that's actually the techniques I have used in taking people with disabilities with me to the Capitol. And once they actually obtain those techniques and are doing them well, then I take a back seat. I put that person up front. I'm just there for their support at that point, if they need it at all, because at that point, that constituent with the disability is much more important than I am. Whether I'm a lobbyist or another advocate training or supporting the person, they're the ones with the message. And so it takes time to perfect these techniques. And so I would say practice, practice, practice. Especially when it comes to the personal story, you want to hone it down to the most important facts. You want to make sure you don't go off in the weeds. You want no embellishment. And you must tell things in chronological order, or the recipient gets confused as to the story. Very commonly. That's how I leverage constituents and advocates to become empowered. Those types of approaches. And when I say practice, it takes practice. Write out the story, trim it down, have the person stand up in front of your committee or your grassroots organization and practice. Because practicing those techniques actually then obtain perfection. And that's what you want in that setting. Does that answer your question, Tyler?
It does, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions from anyone?
Julie, this is Tony. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, great presentation, very informational. Thank you, and everyone else who, Tyler, et cetera, helped to plan for this webinar.
Our pleasure.
My question pertains specifically to the high-profile issues that are facing people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. Right now, the Senate is deliberating changes to health care. Mm-hmm. The overwhelming consensus among many bipartisan think tanks is that it's going to be very devastating for people with disabilities. How is it that we can, as advocates, mobilize? What specific strategies would you recommend that we employ as advocates about the current proposed changes to healthcare? What are we able to do to advocate on the behalf of people with disabilities when, again, there's a consensus in the bipartisan community that this is very detrimental if passed the proposed changes? What can we do?
Put a face on it. That's the first thing you want to do. You don't want to talk about what's being proposed. You don't want to refer to any bill number. You don't want to quote, who the sponsor is. Stay away from that type of activity so you're not viewed as lobbying, but personalize the topic. Take a person who right now receives services in the community, saving the state and the federal government funding by residing in the least restrictive setting and living as independently as possible with these supports, whether it's in-home services, whether it's their benefits, whether it's access to health care, and take those topics and personalize what the person has now, how it has helped them live independently, and potentially, if any one of those supports are lost, what kind of impact it would not only have on quality of life, but also the ability to be healthy, like the rest of society, and also the ability to sustain and manage a disability, especially as we age. So you can take that, any topic, Tony, and put a personal story on it. As for grassroots effort and building strategies, using your center maybe as the base for that, is you have to organize what your goal is first and your objectives. And some of those techniques I explained to you, reach out, build a coalition, reach out, join a group that understands the same issue as or agrees with the issue you're advocating for. So you build your base of support on the issue. And then, especially with healthcare, which I know is an area of great concern for you, you need those stories. You need to know exactly the details of the bill. So I'm going to refer you back to research, because what you may hear in the news, as we all know, may not actually be accurate. So you need to do your own research to find out what that bill really does, and then apply what you have found out to a person's life. And actually, when people lose access to health care or services in the home to remain in the community, you then want to conclude your proposal with an estimated cost of what it would cost the state and the federal government for that person to lose those benefits or to lose the supports and services they have in the community. So I'm really, overall, I'm saying personalize it, especially if they're a constituent of who they're going to see. And, of course, build your supports as an organization. Some other organizations that may come on board may have a registered lobbyist. And registered lobbyists are used to writing talking points for the people they serve. If there's not a registered lobbyist, then write your own. Write your own talking points, because you want to make sure your talking points are driving the issue you are conveying. You don't want a talking point that doesn't add to your message. There's no point of having it. So really, Tony, it's organization. It's reaching out to others and joining together. It's doing your research so you know your facts before you write your talking points or you bring people in on the strategy. And also, it's the group or the people you're working with to set the goal and objective of the agenda. If people aren't on the same page of what the goal and objective is, then people send different messages. The only difference should be the application of somebody's personal story to the topic. That's the only difference between what's being said in one office versus the other. Did I answer your question, or were you looking for something different?
No, that's very helpful, Julie. Let me ask you this. So we are interested in providing an educational forum. What the proposed changes to healthcare may be. And are we able to say, hey, under the House bill, these are the 5 things that will change, and under the Senate bill, these are the 5 things that will change. This is what the supporters of these changes say why it's good, and these are why the detractors say that it's bad. Are we able to disseminate information as long as we can talk both sides of the issue?
No, you can, but you can't refer to bills as an advocate. You shouldn't be talking bill number. You shouldn't be talking, you should be talking the topic. The topic of health. Can we say
the American Health Care Act, or should we be saying the specific issue, the proposed changes to Medicaid, the cuts that are being proposed?
Correct. Because then
that specific, or can we be broad enough to say American Health Care Act without saying a bill number?
Yes. Yes. If you stay topic focused and you stay away from bill numbers, and you stay topic focused, then that's an easy technique to make sure you're not crossing that line into lobbying. You want
to educate. Can we, as the Center for Independent Living, say we oppose the proposed cuts to Medicaid, or we propose cuts? that are in the bill, but not say that it's the bill?
Actually, I would recommend that you create a document that says, what is the impact of the proposed changes to the Healthcare Act? How will that impact people with disabilities? Stay focused on your advocacy techniques. So rather than saying, we oppose these proposed cuts, I would most likely create talking points that talks about the impact of the proposed cuts on these people and tie it to that personal story. I wouldn't refer to any bill number, stay topic focused, and then you don't need a bill number because they know what you're talking about. And that way you're not taking a lobbying stance on a topic. You are taking a stance on what you are providing education on what can happen to the people you serve, your constituents.
So if I was going to pivot and say, okay, now we want to talk about the proposed federal budget and cuts to disability services, would that be the same approach that you would recommend that I was asking about in terms of the health care? Or is that different? Is that not a bill? I mean, that's a budget.
Actually, a budget has a bill. A budget is a bill, always. So any proposed legislation has a bill number, which you, of course, haven't heard about in the news or anything. They're referring to it by topic. You can talk about the impact of the proposed cuts or reductions of benefits and services for the people you serve. Okay? What I would do, if I was going to hold a public forum on the healthcare cuts alone, or the Medicaid cuts alone, then I wouldn't call the public forum a public forum on the proposed healthcare cuts or Medicaid cuts. I would call the forum and promote it in a way that doesn't create that gray matter. So I would hold the public forum on how Medicaid or how those benefits and services or access to health care actually reduces costs to the state and federal government, maintains people in the least restrictive setting, focus on the benefits of what they are receiving rather than, and then let them tell their story or use a story, because some people are going to be forced back into institutions if the proposed cuts pass, okay? So use what's going to happen to that person. But I wouldn't necessarily create a forum on the proposed federal cuts. I would create a forum on the future for people with disabilities, or use a different language, and that way you're totally steering clear of lobbying activities. Does that help?
Thank you, it does. Thank you, Julie.
Yes, stay focused on topic. Think topic all the time. Think impact, okay? Think how the person can do what they're doing now. What do they get that helps them do that? And what potentially could happen to that person if any one of those supports or services are reduced or pulled away. Stay focused on topic, not what you're hearing in the news. That type of language, opposing McConnell's Senate proposed legislation, opposing the federal budget cuts, etc. You want to say topic focused.
This is Maya, and I have a question. I'm on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
What is the inappropriateness of anyone on staff at a center on their personal time from their personal phone asking a legislator to support or oppose a certain bill or legislation?
You have to make sure. I'm sorry. you have to make sure that they are not associating you with where you work.
Okay.
That they understand, you know, because some people help with political campaigns. They knock on doors and hand out flyers, but they do it on their own time. And the other thing I would look at is, what's your policy and procedure within your agency related to behavior or activities outside of the work hours? I'd turn there first.
Mm-hmm.
And make sure that what you want to do complies with that policy and procedure. And then, of course, making it very clear that you are there as an individual or as their constituent. And that's how many times people can help with political campaigns. You're not involved in the campaign, you're not directly campaigning, but you can be in your off hours knocking on doors, handing out flyers, answering a phone. Okay, so that's how I separate it.
Thank you.
And it's important that advocates and people with disabilities help support, and let me change the word support, but help people with political campaigns, because that also gives you that extra leg up when they want to ask for help.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? I really appreciate everybody hanging on the phone way past our proposed time. And if you think of anything in the future that you'd like to ask, my email address is Julie, Julie, at D for disability, S for solutions, I for independent, L for living.org. So if something pops up later, and I'm a person that usually things pop up later, please send me an email. I'd be glad to answer it. And once again, these are the beginning of your toolkit. I always think of advocates like carpenters who have that carpenter belt, and they have different tools in each pouch. So this is the beginning of your tools to raise your advocacy efforts into the political arena that impacts, as you know, the political arena impacts numerous aspects of our lives.
I'm sorry, Julie, can you repeat your email, please?
Yes, it's Julie, Julie, at D for disability, S for solutions, I for independent, L for living.org.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Everybody have a good night, and hopefully stay dry with all the storms.
Thank you so much.